Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we'll be visiting with Miss Rene Harris from the El Paso Museum of History. And Miss Harris was nice enough to give us a tour of the museum a while back, and we'll be taking a look at some of the different exhibits there. Welcome to Along the Rio Grande.
Thank you.
Maybe we should start by talking a little bit about what the museum is. What is the El Paso Museum of History?
We are one of 3 city museums here in El Paso. We are given the charge through our mission statement to tell the story of El Paso and the surrounding area from the coming of the Spaniards until the present time. So that's roughly 400 years of history.
How did the museum get started?
Well, in 1974 it began as the Cavalry Museum, but the name and focus were changed in 1980 to really reflect the history of the area. We have many fine history museums here in El Paso, but there really wasn't one that told the overall story of the area, and that's what we do.
Okay. And your background and your training, how did you become involved with the museum?
Well, I have 3 different degrees and trained to work in museums specifically and in history museums.
How do you become trained to work in a museum?
University, undergraduate and graduate
Programs.
work. Yes, there are degrees where you can work on a degree in museum work, museology, museum science. It has different titles, but that's basically what it is. You have to learn how museums operate, what is correct policy and procedure for caring for artifacts, administration, conservation, public programs, a whole host of things, as well as whatever specialty you may have, which may be history or anthropology or biology, depending on whether you work in an art museum or a natural history museum or history or archaeology or different subject material.
Sure. And how did you come to the El Paso Museum?
I was looking for a job, and they advertised, and I moved here and took the job. I've worked in several different museums in different capacities before I moved to El Paso.
What kind of exhibits and displays do we have at the museum? There's different categories of exhibits, correct?
Oh, well, sure. There are things which are permanent exhibits, although for many museums they're never exactly completely permanent. They are semi-permanent because as we are able, we try and upgrade as more information becomes available to us or we need to revamp and spruce things up. We try and do that as we are able. Also, there are temporary exhibits, and that gives us a chance to highlight different subjects, to focus on something in a little more detail, perhaps. We may borrow objects or artifacts, documents, and so forth from other institutions or individuals for a temporary exhibit, and that's usually there 2 to 3 months. Then we try and spin off different programs and activities for the public in connection with those temporary exhibits.
Now, some of the exhibits that we're going to be looking at are part of the more permanent exhibits. How are those designed and put together? Who's responsible for that?
Well, a collection of people through the years, because they have been developed over a period of time. So back in the 80s, I think Bill Rackesee and there were 4 other artists that worked on some of the things that you'll see in the museum. Then the curator, Barbara Angus, and I have worked on things through the years as well. So it's a collection of different people that have worked on exhibits.
And what kind of temporary exhibits have you had? What kind of local exhibits or ones that you've brought in from other places?
Right. We've had a wide variety. We are fortunate to be able to do that because our mission statement determines what we can have and not have. There are some subjects that might be wonderful or temporary exhibits we'd love to have, but they don't fit in with our mission, and so therefore they're not feasible for us to do. What we have done through the years, we've focused on saddle makers, boot makers here in the area. We had a wonderful temporary exhibit of the art of Jose Guadalupe Posada, who was a wonderful artist and did broadsides that are very well known, especially in connection with the Day of the Dead or El Dia de los Muertos. We've had exhibit on famous El Pasoans. Which I think people were surprised to know the breadth of different people that have lived here.
Who are some of the famous El Pasoans we may not be familiar with?
Debbie Reynolds, Gene Roddenberry of Star Trek fame, many athletes, the Secretary of the Army, currently, well, not Chief Justice, but Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, a whole host of people, a whole host of people.
And you put together these exhibits. You have research people that will be working on planning an exhibit?
Well, basically, because we have such a tiny staff, it's the curator again and I that generally do the research on things. And so we will look at what is feasible to do. Is there enough information? Are there enough visuals? Because museums are actually, after all, visual. Sure. There's some things that they're wonderful topics, but we don't have anything to illustrate the topic. So that makes a better book or paper or article than it will an exhibit for people to see. So we determine whether, if there's a topic or a particular collection that comes to our attention that would be apropos for us to have. We do a lot of research, an awful lot of research, because we want to be as accurate as is humanly possible. I just read an article that people trust 80% of the people surveyed trust museums and what they say about history versus what is taught in schools. So we have a real duty to do as accurate a job as possible in the research we do. We look for ways to augment with the artifacts, graphics, photographs, drawings, different things. We try when we can to do something that's, in our case, very low-tech, interactive, but to involve people so it's not just a passive look around at things. And it
you were
takes a lot to plan.
You were kind enough to show us around some of the exhibits last fall, and we're going to take a look here at a tour of the museum. We can watch it on the monitor here.
Okay.
Let's look at some of the exhibits at the El Paso Museum of History. I see we have an example here of Spanish colonial agriculture. Could you tell us a little bit about what we see here?
Yes, this is actually a rawhide wine vat. Normally people think of barrels made of wood or oak casks when they think of winemaking, but because we are short of wood here in the desert, the early Spanish settlers were very clever and used what they had around them, which was their cattle. So they used rawhide to make their wine vats. Grapes were actually introduced by the early Franciscan missionaries here in this area in the 1600s, and they made wine at first for mass. But because the grapes flourished so well here in the El Paso Valley, it became the major trade or export item from the 1600s until the 1800s. So we're very fortunate to have it.
So we had a lot of vineyards in this area?
Lots of vineyards, orchards, dried fruit, and again, pass, wine or brandy were the major export to trade items for those things which people couldn't make or grow for themselves here in this area.
So we have a long history of agriculture in the Lower Valley area. This is simply an example of it.
Right, not only in the Lower Valley, but all through this area. It's like the Nile in Egypt, where you had the river, you had the opportunity to use acequias and irrigate and grow most of people's food crops here.
And we have an example here of a Victorian room from the late 1800s. This is a period of time when El Paso grew quite rapidly.
Indeed. This sort of room is possible after 1881, when the railroads arrived, because it was much cheaper and easier for people to get these kinds of goods by rail in boxcars than it was bumping over trails for months in wagons. So people could order things from Sears or Montgomery Ward in Chicago, from New York, from Mexico City, from anywhere. And so El Paso stops being a town built completely of adobe and starts resembling more of a Victorian Western American town with brick buildings and so forth.
And what kinds of things do we see here?
Well, this actually would have been a bedroom and sitting room, if you will. So you not only have where someone would have slept here, the bedroom furniture, but you also have a sewing machine. This one, of course, treadle powered without electricity in those days. Has a shuttle instead of a bobbin in the early sewing machines. The clothing, of course, is from the 1880s. On hot summer days, I think we can all be sympathetic to people wearing clothes that were buttoned up with high collars and tight sleeves and long sleeves, even in warm weather.
And there were several layers under those clothing as well.
Oh, many layers. If a lady of that time period were here, she would have a full-length chemise, a corset cover, drawers, stockings with garters, at least one petticoat or two, plus the bustle under the garment itself. So it would have been pretty uncomfortable, I think. One other interesting thing, many Victorian houses did not have closets. So clothes, sheets, towels, and the usual things we all stuff into our closets were put into trunks. So they not only performed the function of being luggage on trips, but they were also storage in the house itself.
I see that we have a series of dioramas here that depict different stages of El Paso history. Who designed these? Who created these?
The original dioramas in the museum were done by Bill Rackesee and three people who were part of the CETA program back in the 80s.
Now here we have the railroad coming to El Paso. That's a very important event in the development of the city. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the railroads were a big factor in the growth of El Paso. Before 1881 and its arrival, coming actually from California going east, El Paso was just a village with a few hundred people. It set off explosive growth.
Train travel was a big improvement over what was available before.
It was a huge improvement over previous public transportation, if you will, on stagecoaches. For people who travel today, who may have driven or flown to San Antonio, they're used to an hour and a half trip by plane, maybe a full day of driving on I-10. By stage, it would have been 18 days. For people traveling to Santa Fe, it was a 13-day trip one way. So a 2-day train trip was a huge improvement over those long stagecoach trips.
Now the railroad brought a lot of different groups to the El Paso area, created quite a diversity in the population.
This is a time of phenomenal growth for El Paso. Many of the railroad workers were Chinese, coming from California. You had African Americans, Mexicans, Irish, huge number of people. It's the Old West part of our history, with people coming from everywhere in the United States and elsewhere to what they hoped would be a new boom town.
Now the railroad was simply one more transportation system that came into the area. We've had a lot of other changes since then. El Paso remains an important transportation hub. How did that develop?
Well, after the stagecoaches and the trains, today of course we have I-10, we have air travel. This is a huge transshipment point with NAFTA. So we're just a little bit of a different sort of hub today.
And of course, Fort Bliss is a very important part of the history of El Paso. I see we have here a diorama showing one of the very early locations of it. It's changed several times during its history though, right?
Actually, Fort Bliss has occupied 6 different places here in El Paso. This is number 5, actually. In the 1880s, Fort Bliss was located down practically next door to what is now the La Hacienda restaurant on Paisano. 2 of these buildings are still there as apartment buildings. They were officers' quarters in the 1880s. Fort Bliss moved to its current location when the railroads came in after the 80s because, as you may imagine, right there, right in the pass by the river, it's rather narrow, and the railroads ended up coming right through the middle of the parade ground, and so it got moved to its present location. But it has been located close to McGoffinsville, not too far from the McGoffin home today. it was in 2 different sites downtown as well. So its current home is its 6th location.
And of course, Fort Bliss played quite a role in the Mexican Revolution as well, and maybe we can take a look at some of the things that took place during the 19-teens connected to those two.
Okay.
Now this is an interesting relic from the Mexican Revolution era. What do we have here?
What we have is a homemade cannon. Revolutionaries crossed the river and adopted, if you will, a railroad axle from the El Paso and Southwestern railroad lines, took it to Pearson. The axle was drilled to make the barrel of the cannon. And with a canister of black powder and some scrap iron, it made a rather homemade cannon that was used. We're not sure that the wheels are original to it. They are buggy wheels. But this is one of those things which would have had limited ability to adjust for range and height and distance and so forth. But it's an example of the ingenuity of the revolutionaries of the time period.
Now, many of the people that we associate with the history of the Mexican Revolution were actually in El Paso at one point during the conflict.
That's right. There were actually a lot of people associated with the revolution that were here. Porfirio Diaz, who was president of Mexico for over 30 years, was here and actually the first president of Mexico to meet face-to-face with a president of the United States, President Taft, in 1909. They had meetings here in Juarez and El Paso. Just a year later, the revolution began. Such notable figures such as Francisco Madero were here in 1911. Others like Pancho Villa was here on and off for a number of years in the area, as was Pascual Orozco, another revolutionary and for a while a cohort of Villas. Another person that we, or at least in Mexico, is not too popular these days is Huerta. Huerta, in fact, was buried in Concordia Cemetery and now is an evergreen cemetery. So when you look at the figures of people that we often read about, there are a number of them that spent some time here in the area.
And there were a number of events in the Revolution that took place in this area?
Actually, yes. Beginning in May of 1911, there were 5 separate battles for Juarez between 1911 and 1929. And many Americans, of course, watched. There are many stories here of people standing on what is now the Camino Real Hotel and watching the fighting across the river. This was a hotbed for journalists. Of course, there was no video in those days, so people were taking photographs and writing their stories, sending them off by wire to go into newspapers all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. You have many stories that people have locally of memories of their families during these time periods. Many different scenes, if you will, of things that they remember. People also were occasionally wounded by gunfire crossing the river inadvertently and catching people standing on top of boxcars watching as well. So the stories are endless.
Now we have a few different businesses that have played an important role in the development of El Paso, such as Weaver Scope.
Right. You don't often think of scopes, rifle scopes or handgun scopes in El Paso, but for nearly 50 years, Weaver Scope was a part of the business community here in the city. They developed because in the 1930s there were not many scopes available in the United States, and they were mostly European and very expensive. So they set about to develop a really good quality scope that would be made here. And it was a big business here through the 1980s. In addition, a lot of people are familiar with the textile industry, with jeans and other plants, some of which are no longer here with us, some of which still are, of course. Another industry that is associated with El Paso is leatherworking. Many people today are familiar with Tony Lama and Lucchese and many other custom boot makers here in the area. But our history with leatherworking goes far beyond that. El Paso was a center of ranching industry in the area, West Texas, southern New Mexico, northeastern Chihuahua.
And so people were making boots and saddles and bridles and all sorts of related gear for cowboys and ranching in this area long before we became known, perhaps today, better for our boots.
And we have some examples of the way that technology changes over time. Here's an interesting example, a telephone switchboard.
Right. The telephone switchboard was used until the 1960s, which doesn't seem like it's that long ago, 30 years, well, to some of us anyway. But especially to younger people, everything today is fiber optics. We all have cell phones, pagers, and the like. And so the switchboard is really an anachronism today when we look at it and realize that that operators had to direct calls.
And some of the businesses that are still here are listed here on the switchboard and had to be patched in.
That's right. So you can see which businesses are still around and see how many you recognize.
Another example of changes in technology, phonographs, sound recording. And we have some examples here of some of the differences.
Right. Today we're used to CD players and cassettes, and who knows what's coming next. These examples are very early examples of sound recording. The earliest one is the wax cylinder. Most people don't even recognize what it is. That comes before the phonograph. The earliest records had grooves only on one side. They're a little thicker and play on one side. Later development was grooves and playing on both sides.
Well, certainly a great variety of exhibits there, a lot of interesting material. There's going to be some changes for the museum. Could you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about how that developed?
Well, we are very happy about the results of the bond election on May 6th. All 4 issues passed, one of them being the History Museum complex to go downtown. So, I have not received the word yet of the exact dates under which this will move forward, but we will be building, the city will be building a new history museum downtown.
And this will tie in with a number of the different downtown projects that are underway.
I think it's going to lend itself very well to a number of projects that are going on. We already have the new art museum downtown. We have Insights Museum. I think the downtown library is going to be undergoing some expansion as well and upgrading. And the other efforts in Union Plaza and other areas of downtown, the Oñate statue that's going to go in as well, I think are going to be on the same block in Cleveland Square. So I think will tie in nicely with other efforts, the expansion of the Civic Center. So
Sure.
I think that should provide lots of things to do and tie in together downtown.
Now, what will be different about the new facility? Or be different types of exhibits or different?
We'll redesign from scratch.
Okay.
The building will be, it's estimated right now, probably about 3 times the size of what we currently have. We desperately need classroom space and meeting space and auditorium space and more storage for our collections, which are growing and need more space desperately. Also, we will retool our exhibits from scratch. It will allow us to expand on some of the things we have already and touch on topics that we don't have room for right now, which need to be addressed as part of the history of this community. So,
Will we have different types of exhibits? Are there things we'll be able to do in a new facility that we can't do in the current one?
one of the things we're looking at and planning now as we look at the planning for the new museum are a children's discovery area, or we may actually integrate those kinds of pockets within the permanent exhibits themselves. Yes, we will redo. Our exhibits are woefully out of date. So there are lots of things we can do that I think will make them more interesting and exciting for visitors.
And temperature and climate and that will play a role in this as well?
Absolutely. We won't, I think, have to suffer with the heat and humidity from swamp coolers in our current building. So that's what museums need, are stable environment year-round. So we'll have a much more controlled climate within the building, which will be not only more comfortable for visitors, but will be much better for the objects and artifacts themselves.
Sure. If people are interested in helping out with the museum, what kinds of things can they get involved in?
Oh, always need help in a variety of ways. We intend to have a docent training class this fall, which we'll announce through the newspaper and other media. We need these people very much. We have several thousand school children and scouts and other groups that come through every year, and adults. And we train people. I think most of our docents have been really fascinated. They learned things they never dreamed about our city and area. And it's a chance, if you enjoy people, you have to enjoy people because you're going to work with them. That's one thing that we're always in need of docents. We need people that can help if you have great graphic skills or carpentry skills. We can always use those in connection with exhibits. We can use anybody with PR background to help us out. Help with the gift shop, you name it, we have a spot available.
Well, hopefully we can get some of our viewers to volunteer and help out with the museum, especially since we're going to be undergoing so many changes in the near future. And I want to thank you for coming in the studio today and visiting with us a bit and telling us about all of these things, and especially for allowing us to bring our equipment out there and photograph so many different areas of the museum. We really appreciate that. Ms. Rene Harris from the El Paso Museum of History, thank you. And thank all of you for joining us as well today on Along the Rio Grande, and we hope to see you on our next program.